Last week, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the mobilization of 300,000 reservists to fight in the war with Ukraine. He also announced referendums to join the Russian Federation to take place in several Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine, the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. And Western media reports the voting is a sham, with people being held at gunpoint. There have also been reports of widespread demonstrations in Moscow and around Russia, protesting against the war, and reports of men fleeing the country. However, reports from Russian sources and within Ukraine tell a different story. So here to tell us what she's been seeing and hearing in Moscow is Fiorella Isabel, journalist with RT, and you may know her from the Convo Couch. Fee, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Kim. I'm excited.
What are you hearing from what's going on in Moscow? I mean, I've been hearing, of course, here in Western media, we hear widespread protests, people rising up against Putin, up against the war. I do know some people in Russia that are not in the news. They're not media, they're not journalists, they're not political in any way, and they're saying, yeah, there were some, but there's way bigger demonstrations in support. But they're saying, yes, there are men fleeing the country. So, I mean, what's going on from your perspective in Moscow? What are you hearing and seeing?
Right. So, like your friend said, basically there is a lot of there was, as soon as this came out, there was a little bit of fear as to what this meant. Really, a lot of people, though, mostly came out in support into the streets. And there are countless videos I've been sharing. Thousands, 50,000 people showed up in the center of Moscow at Red Square to support the referendums and stand in solidarity with the people who want to join, from the Donetsk People's Republic, the Luhansk republics, and also, of course, the cities of Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. And there's just so many other territories that want to join Russia. Now, there were counter protests. They were a lot smaller in numbers, and it's usually the same people that have been supportive of the Alex Navalny, the U.S.-backed sort of, more, I would say, liberal type of people that tend to support, and they reside in Moscow. There's a lot of them in Moscow, especially because Moscow is a very it's a capitalist area. It's an area that had a lot of Western interaction with a lot of the corporations that were here. So you have that as well. But majorly, you had so many Muscovites go out and show up in support of the referendum. Now, there were people fleeing in the beginning, some mostly men, because they were afraid of being drafted. And I can explain more on the draft in a second, but it's mandatory in Russia, so everybody knows, to serve 1 year of military for men, right? But this has always been the case. It's been the case for a long time. It used to be 2 years. And it's 1. And basically that doesn't mean that you go into battle. It could be you're just serving, doing whatever duty in whatever field. It's not like you have to go fight in a war or anything for a year. So just to clarify that as well. And like I said, most people in Russia have various opinions on Vladimir Putin. However, people outside of Moscow themselves have been largely more in support of the special military operation, which is what Russia and the majority of Russia and Putin calls it, not a war or an intervention, but a special military intervention.
Mm-hmm. So what is the sentiment? I mean, I would imagine as soon as the announcement of 300,000 reservists would be drafted in, or called up, because as you mentioned, they're all reservists in the military anyway. They're already serving. At what age do they have to serve that year?
So it's 18. So I'm just going to factually state what the Ministry of Defense has said, because this is what they said. The Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, that the people that were subject to mobilization are privates and sergeants up to 35 years old, junior officers up to 50 years old, senior officers up to 55 years old, starting at 18 years old. And the people who will not be called were reserved citizens, including employees of defense industry enterprises, people who were unfit for health, people who have a health issue, students. Putin definitely just specifically did a double law where he specifically said, if you're a student in any way, you are not you don't have to participate in this at all. If you are caring for a family member and they depend on you, you have that as well. Disabled people, if you have 4 or more children under the age of 16 and they're your dependents, and also if your mother has 4 or more children under the age of 8 and doesn't have a husband. So there are a lot of exceptions to that. But again, it's people that have experience in the military and have already been serving. It's not just any person out. So, but there was a lot of fear, like you said, surrounding this, right? Because you hear a lot of the Western media saying, "Oh my God, they're drafting all these people." But if you look at Russian media and media that is more independent, you see that a lot of people were going voluntarily to sign on to actually serve. There were long lines of people signing in to join this, because what's been going on in the Donetsk People's Republic, in Donbass, where other journalists right now are looking at the referendums, there has been an up on the shelling of civilian areas there by the Ukrainian military. And so a lot of the people there have been asking Russia for help and protection. And in this way, with the referendum, what changes is if these territories do vote in favor of joining Russia, they're joining the Russian Federation, then that gives them status as being a part of Russia. So if Ukraine continues to target civilians in Russia, now that escalates things further, because they're not just targeting civilians in Ukraine,
right?
That independent sovereign democracies in Ukraine, like the Donetsk People's Republic or the Lugansk Republic, they're targeting now Russian civilians. And that, of course, escalates the situation further.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you mention all of the exceptions when it comes to the reservists that are being called up, because, you know, the reports that we're hearing here, and this now makes sense when you clarify it, the reports that we're hearing here is that it's way more than 300,000 people that are actually being called up. And that makes sense if they're saying, okay, we're going to call up 1 million of them because a bunch of them are going to have these exceptions and these exemptions. And so once they get called up and we ask them, then we say, okay, this person's exempt, and we move on to the next. So that actually now makes more sense why we're hearing some of these reports of it's way more than 300,000 who are actually being called in. So, and now as far as claiming, now these areas in the Donbass have not been under Ukrainian control for a long time, since 2014. So 8, nearly 9 years. They haven't really been under the control of Ukraine. And so it makes sense that these areas would want to maybe join Russia for protection. They're mainly Russian speaking people, right? But are people afraid in Russia that declaring these areas really truly part of the Russian Federation, and then hearing what Putin said about nuclear warfare, potentially about using every available option to him to protect the Russian people, and if these people suddenly become the Russian people, are people afraid in Russia? Are you hearing fear of like nuclear war?
Right. So initially that was a lot of the fear, but okay, so the Donbass has been at war for the last 8 years, since 2014, the Maidan and all of that happened, correct? But there has been constant shelling there by Ukraine for that entire time. People weren't allowed to speak Russian, and a lot of these people are ethnically Russian, meaning like they are Russian speaking, they have a Russian culture, and they have been subjugated by the Ukrainian army for this whole time, being shelled. And so that's why they've been wanting, they became the independent Donetsk and Lugansk republics with the support of Russia. That, however, still means they're independent. They don't have Russia. With this, they would have Russia's protection. So now when you talk about what Putin said in terms of we are willing to use every weapon at our disposal, he said this after he has said countless times, and after the Sergei Lavrov and others have said that Russia isn't willing to use nuclear weapons. That's like something they don't want to do. They have a plan, like every country does, in case of a nuclear weapon, blah, blah, blah. But they have specifically made several calls against using nuclear weapons. In fact, Sergei Lavrov was just asked at a UN Security Council meeting about this very question. What about, what Putin just said? Well, Putin said every weapon at our disposal. He didn't say nuclear arms. People assume that because of that because he wasn't clear, right? And I get why people thought, oh my God, like, does this mean Russia is escalating? And Lavrov also reminded people that the United States has been the country that has used these weapons and nobody else has. There hasn't been a shift in Russians saying we're going to go to nuclear war. What they simply mean is the special military operation has changed its tactic now. Initially, it was to, as we recall, denazify Russia and to liberate these territories that asked for its help. And where they got a lot of criticism was, why didn't they go in sooner from a lot of these people? Because a lot of these people die. If Russia leaves a territory and Ukraine tries to get it back, like it just happened, they go after these people as traitors, as they're saboteurs or compromised. So a lot of the SBU units go and they murder people who were found to be pro-Russian. And so that's why they're so adamant in getting this referendum through. Now, does this escalate the conflict? Absolutely, because now because NATO has been at war with Russia, right? But this is what Putin and Lavrov have said is like, we're not at war with Ukraine. We're really at war with the collective of NATO.
Right.
And that's a very important point to make, because if Russia doesn't do this, this is according to the Ministry of Defense, they see this as a fight for their existence as Russia, as it is, its sovereignty. And so now Ukraine is never going to be the same again. The Ukraine that we knew before this conflict is gone. They have said there's not going to be any sort of compromise or any sort of negotiations now in those terms. It's the Donetsk People's Republic, the Lugansk, and all the territories that want to be liberated and want to be a part of Russia are going to be allowed to be a part of Russia. And if NATO, the West, their allies, and Ukraine disrespect that, then that means that they're attacking Russia. So Russia is going to respond militarily, but there are many ways they can respond militarily without using nuclear weapons. And that's
right.
what I think we're going to see is them really Russia supplying these territories with Russian troops. That's what we're seeing. This is the second phase of the conflict. It's not as much of like now, oh my God, now we're going to use nuclear war. It's like, no, we're going to send more men, because let's remind everybody, Russia is only using like a small percentage of their military force. They have far greater military than what they've been using in Donetsk. And that's been part of the criticism, is why Russia hasn't responded back when they keep shelling civilians. We need Russia to respond. Well, this is Putin finally responding and saying, okay, well, we're going to put more men and more forces to combat what Ukraine is doing now. And that's where they're going.
So you've been in Moscow for a few months now. I mean, are the people really truly supportive of this effort, or is it that they're afraid? Because, that's what we always hear here in the West is
Right.
they're afraid to speak out. They're afraid to protest. They're afraid to go against Putin. They're putting their lives at risk if they do. What have you been hearing from just the average person that you've come across in Russia?
So the average person understands that this is not just Ukraine. Like, this isn't just about Ukraine. They understand that the West and the United States are involved. And that's something that I think a lot of the people from the US, right? A lot of Americans like us, they don't understand that. So it's interesting that the average Russian does understand that. Like I said, Moscow is a very, it has a lot of European influences, just like St. Petersburg does. But the average Russian is very proud to be Russian. They have a certain national pride of being Russian, whether they like Putin or not. And that sort of is greater than how they feel about Putin, because they know that if the West intervenes, then there is that sort of like potential of losing it. Now, the youth as a whole, when I've talked to the youth, they're more anti-Putin. They're more pro-Western. They more have like, you look at American media. They're the ones that Navalny actually tried to get on his side when he was saying he was a political prisoner.
When you say youth, like what ages are youth?
I'm talking about 18 to like 25,
Okay.
in that age group, maybe a little bit
Like
older than that.
college age kids.
Yeah, they're the
Okay.
ones that the West has been targeting in terms of like propaganda, in terms of like, yeah, having like TikTokers and YouTubers and that whole thing. And there's a lot of that happening, which is why Russia is very like always talks about that media aspect of it. So that group, because also you have to remember they were too young to know what was going on during the Soviet Union and the USSR and the fall of the USSR, whereas their grandparents tend to be more pro USSR, more pro Putin, because they are afraid of Western intervention. They're afraid of losing Russia as a whole. So there's a disconnect, and what I see happening is that disconnect is happening with younger people who don't know the history as well because they weren't alive to see everything that happened. So there is some of that, but the majority of people that I've seen as a whole in Russia, whether they like Putin, whether they don't like Putin, is they have zero animosity towards Ukraine in terms of the Ukrainian people. They have family members, they have brothers, sisters, friends. They would often go to Ukraine and hang out there. Like none of these people want Ukrainians to be like, murdered or die in war. Like that is not the sentiment I have seen from anybody, whether they like Putin, whether they hate Putin, or whether they're ambivalent. It's more of like they don't like that this is happening. They wish it wasn't happening. They wish they could travel freely, but they don't like the response from the West, where they've been singled out as being awful. They say, well, if I go to America, I'm not looked on positively now. And, they ask me why I'm even here, like during this time, like that it's crazy that I come during this time because there's so much conflict. And they haven't been anti-American towards me and towards other colleagues that have come in from the United States. They're not at all. They're actually very, very curious and welcoming. So I do think that the sentiment in Moscow is very much divided in terms of whether they support or reject the special military operation, but outside of the main cities, right? Outside of the big city of Moscow, people are more receptive and they're more pro the special military operation. They call it a special military operation. They don't call it a war. They are more supportive of the people in the Donbass because they have a different acknowledgement of everything that goes on, and they're less receptive and they're less used to seeing the Western aspect of it, which is why their viewpoints are a little bit different. But I do think overall Putin has more support than he has negative support, and I think that comes more from keeping Russia as Russia rather than being pro Putin, if you get what I'm saying. Yeah.
Right. Interesting. I mean, it's good to get your perspective on this since you've been there for the last few months, and people should really follow your work. You're doing a great job reporting on your Twitter account. Your Twitter handle is at Fiorella Isabel M, and I'll put that down. Well, it's there on the screen for people to see. So follow Fiorella on Twitter. Doing really great reports, and also traveling around even in South America, doing reports in South America. You've been all over South America, now also covering the election coming up in Brazil.
Yes.
So you're like all over the place. You're all over the world. It's like, where's Fee?
Well, thank you. Yes, it's fun. I enjoy this work. I think I'm a workaholic. Like I really like it. I just don't stop. But
Yeah.
I really love it, and I think it needs to be done. Especially going to where you report, so people can't say you're like lying. And
Right.
when you see because you do see protests for both ends of the spectrum, but there's definitely more people in protest and support of these referendums, and the Western media only shows one side. And I would be more receptive to what the West is saying if they weren't banning what Russia is saying as well. So that's
right. Exactly. It's such a one-sided report. And actually, I think France is the only Western country that, from my view, that is somewhat being a bit more, allowing more of the of differences in viewpoints. I notice that it's a lot of times French reporters that are saying, stating the obvious that's happening. Because they're more neutral in this. They're trying to be, at least. So,
Yeah.
they're trying to, come to some agreement. There was definitely a lot of time when they were definitely trying to get the two sides together to talk it out and stuff. So really interesting, but we're going to keep following your reports coming from Moscow, coming from all around the world. Can't keep up with you. I never know where you are whenever I'm contacting. I'm like, where are you now? So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.